Wholeness means to me being in a state of joy.
Wholeness means feeling complete, owning my authentic gifts.
Wholeness is really connected. Everything is connected to everything.
Wholeness is where we have access to all parts of ourselves.
When I happened upon Lisa Campion's book, I was drawn in an unusual way. And as I listened, I was having all sorts of aha and amen moments. I love the simple and clear way that Lisa shares and teaches about the kinds of gifts that some, without some guidance, can feel really uncomfortable or even wrong. I learned so much chatting with Lisa, and I'm sure you will too. She is trained as a therapist, gifted as a Reiki master, and passionate about training and empowering empaths, psychics, and healers, since she believes that the world needs all the healers it can get.
Because there's kind of two styles of awakening. There are the people that have this sudden psychic opening, and that's like somebody turned on the light bulb, flip the light switch, and that can be it can be really exciting, but often can be overwhelming for people. You might feel sort of flooded with psychic information. I think it's particularly challenging when it's visual, if you're a visual psychic, because all of a sudden you're seeing stuff. You're seeing, spirits, you're seeing energy around people. And that I think seeing is believing. So when we see it, it's a little more like, whoa, my goodness, what's happening? And I do see these sudden psychic openings around people who have faced loss, have lost somebody, have had a near-death experience, have, thrown themselves into spiritual practice. Like you went on a super intense yoga teacher training, and you spent 8 hours on the mat meditating, and boom, your psychic pops open. And that's a little bit of a different process. We have to learn how to ground and clear and shut it down and just kind of manage it. And what happens, I think, more often is people have sort of a slow awakening. It's a little more peaceful when that happens. It's just kind of like imagine a dimmer switch, and somebody's gradually turning on, illuminating the room that you've been in. And if that's happening for you, you might notice you have more dreams. You might notice you're sort of in the flow of synchronicities or signs and omens. You become aware of that your intuitive senses kick in. Like you just kind of know stuff. Like you might find yourself say, oh, I knew that was going to happen. Or I have a bad feeling about something, that, it's kind of a more like awakening to a non-ordinary reality that's really happening around us all the time.
Do you think that it's happening more, or are there just more people to talk about it? What's your idea about that? Do you think that's...
Yeah, totally. I think it's happening more for a couple of reasons. I think that we're in this shift of human consciousness. People call it ascension. It's got a lot of different words, but it's sort of this acceleration of human awakening that's happening. And spiritual, the spiritual awakening is really what's happening. And psychic ability is a byproduct of spiritual development. So when we engage in spiritual growth, we awaken sort of the skills of a healer. So you may kind of feel like you can do some healing and that you're more psychic. I think every generation is born a little more psychic than the last one. And I think that we do a lot of things now that people, we have these really powerful spiritual tools that are very common that we didn't used to have. Like, 200, 300 years ago, you'd have to climb to the mountain in Tibet and get to the top of the monastery and bang on the door. And maybe they would teach you yoga and meditation and Reiki. Maybe, and maybe not. And now we have yoga, meditation, and Reiki on every street corner, which I think is a great thing, but so many more people are engaging in these spiritual practices that tend to wake. I always say those are the 3 gateways into like psychic opening, and we do them, and lo and behold, our skills increase. I also feel like it's probably always been part of who we are as humans, and now it's just a little more okay to talk about it.
Right.
So I think people are sharing, and I'm like, I was born in the 60s, and my gifts were really strong when I was a kid, and I knew back then like it wasn't okay to talk about it because you were going straight to the mental hospital if you talked about seeing angels and talking to dead Uncle Fred. That wasn't a good thing,
Right.
So I think now there's a little more like, okay, it's been happening all along, but we're just finally feel safe talking about it.
I think you're right. I definitely feel like my grandma, I get to do a lot of, she gets so thrilled that I get to live a little bit like I do. And she never did, like she never did. And had a lot of health problems. And I wonder if that's part of it, like she was not her own person because of the time that she lived in.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess one way to start with is just to define the word psychic, because I think that word alone, that idea seems so big. And that's what I liked about in your book, is you kind of helped us understand and give us some context around even that word psychic. So how would you describe that?
Yeah, people get all freaked out about that word. It's like, what?
Exactly.
It's got a lot of baggage for some people, that word. And but I think there's really I kind of make a distinction between intuition and psychic ability. First of all, everybody has some. And I think that it's more like athletic ability or musical ability. We've all got some, and it's part of it's very natural. It's just part of us being human, human nature. I don't think we would have survived very long as humans without it. It seems very functional,
right.
Important. And we need to develop it. So we need to work on it. But I think intuition, the way I define it, is sort of our inner knowing. And that's just, I actually really love the term ESP, sort of an old school term, but extrasensory perception. I feel like psychic people process more of the sensory data than other people do consciously. We're just more aware of maybe what's happening. We're kind of putting things together in a symbolic way, a little more fluidly than other people do. But intuition is sort of how we can navigate using our inner wisdom. And we experience that maybe as everyone's had this experience, having a really strong first impression when you meet somebody. You're just right off the bat, you're yes or no, or, that person's shady, or that I really, really dig that person. That's a really common intuitive experience, right? It's sort of a knowing that defies sort of our rational, or even goes contrary to what our rational mind is telling us. And we do need to kind of work on it to develop our intuition more. We need to pay attention. We need to act on it a little bit. We need to notice it and honor it in some ways. But psychic ability is, in the way that I define it, is when we connect to information from outside of ourselves. Well, so what does that mean? That's our spirit guides. That's the angel. That's Dead Uncle Fred. That's when we have, we all have a spirit team. I've done psychic readings for a long, long time. Never met anyone that didn't have a team of spiritual, non-physical spiritual advisors around them. Thank God, because it's really hard to be here on planet Earth. And it'd be nuts if we try to be, down here without some help. So we have the spirit team with us, and psychic ability is sort of reaching for information outside of our own system. It takes a little more training, a little more finessing, but I think it's good to start by acknowledging and bolstering your intuitive, what you're already getting. That's your own inner knowing.
Yeah. And I loved it. And that's why I've shared the book so much, and it's called Psychic, but I'm just read it because it will make more sense. But I think it's, the thing that I think was so helpful about that book is that I love that. And you've said it just a few times now, is the idea that you might need to practice it, or that's part of the process. Because a lot of times, I know for myself, you watch a psychic on TV and you're like, oh, I don't do that. You think you have to be full on, in order to have this kind of gift. And I think there's probably different levels of gift, or whatever, for sure. And you'd probably be the best one to talk about that. But the fact that a practice, I had a good mentor tell me, he says, look, somebody that is a gifted pianist spends hours a day still practicing the piano. And that's, we'd call them very gifted. And sometimes that doesn't get transferred over into this kind of gift. And then I think people, I think a lot of people miss out. And like you say, I think especially young children, because the other people, parents and grownups don't understand, they shut off young, because a look, all you need is a look. You don't have nobody sits you down and says, hey, remember when you said that? That's wrong. Don't say that.
Sometimes
absolutely. They did.
We get the vibe real clear that it freaks us out, that it's free,
real quick.
I mean, real quickly, and I mean, I have heard horror stories from my students about like when they were little kids being like dragged off to the church and having the priest throw holy water on them.
Oh
You know, like,
gosh. Yeah.
you know, I've heard some, or taken to the doctor, or taken to the psych ward, or you know, just
Yes.
like whatever, like sat in the corner, like punished. You
Yep.
know,
Yep. Yeah. It's true.
and you know, it is true. Yeah, and a lot of us, I think, have some trauma, honestly, around our.
Yes.
I certainly did.
Yes.
And when I have people in my psychic training programs, we often have to unpack whatever trauma. Maybe the trauma was being punished or rejected, or having been told that you're crazy, you know, or having seen things or experienced things that were really scary when you were a kid, you know, like
Right.
that happens so common. So we just hit this switch, we just shut it off, you know. And then we, you know, we grow up and we we start our spiritual exploration. We take a yoga class, we learn Reiki, and then boom, all of a sudden, you know, it sort of opens back up again. Or we have really psychic children and we have to deal with it again that way.
Yep.
So I think there's just a lot of wounding. People have been very sort of wounded around, you know, their abilities if they've been rejected. And we can reject them ourselves depending on our own, like if you grow up thinking it's the devil, or you know, depending on your culture and religious, you know, upbringing and sort of messaging that you have around this, whether this is cool or not. Like I really am super thankful for my hippie parents, my liberal hippie parents who like took me to transcendental meditation when I was 10, and I didn't know what was going on with me, but they didn't punish me, you know, for what I was experiencing, and I'm super grateful for that.
Yeah, I definitely had several kids, two especially that I can think of, who were seeing the doctor on a weekly basis, at the psychiatrist, not this, and a therapist, you know, trying to figure out these things. And when you just ask a couple of questions and they tell you things they aren't supposed to know, and their parents were well-meaning, you know what I mean? Their parents were well-meaning in trying to get help for them. But I'm like, that's why I'm like, read this book and you'll see these things are normal. Like, you know, this is, whether you like it or not, this is what's happened. You know, these things are part of their lives. And I love the way you talk about, you know, even that extra sensory, because I feel like, even though I was listening to some of your videos earlier, and I love the way you say go to the body, because that's the thing, is our body is that messenger. I thought about this as I was reading in your book, like sometimes, and you might have already answered this with intuition, but sometimes like, sometimes I get tripped up, or I feel people get tripped up when they want to know the difference between a psychic hit or like they've manifested something. Do you know what I mean? Or a sign from their angels versus like they've manifested something. Do you know what I mean? And where do those cross, or what? How would you answer that question better than I could?
I guess it's like it's sort of we have to sort of take that on a case by case basis, because we make up stuff in our own head, you know, all the time, and that, you know, sometimes it's like our imagination taking over. But what I really notice is a real psychic hit has a very neutral emotional. Some people, you know, people often ask me, how do I tell the difference between the crazy nonsense I make up in my own head versus a real psychic hit? And the answer is, if it's very neutral, you know, even if it's a big deal, just psychic information just sort of comes through like a fact in a way, like, oh, well, that's the thing, you know. And if we're like triggered, nervous, reactive, you know, anxious, that's not a psychic hit. That's our own inner neurosis sort of taking over for a minute. And it is scary if you don't know how to tell the difference. But I think that's the first stage of telling the difference. You know, and I mean, we manifest things all the time, and I don't know, like we create our own reality, we create signs and omens, and I think that's sort of part of our spiritual mojo, like our spiritual magic. And psychic ability is a part of that, you know, like it's a part of our creative force as humans. And I think they're really connected in manifesting magic in your life and psychic ability, spiritual ability. But we sort of we put the cutoff point at triggered. If you're triggered, if you're reactive, it's not that. It's usually a wound or a problem that's sort of arising up in you that's asking to be healed.
That's a good way of putting it. And I'm almost putting it together, because sometimes from the last question, because I think sometimes, you know, if you tell somebody this thing and they think they're like, oh, it's so big, but it wasn't necessarily big for you. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't something that really blew you away. So then you're like, oh, well, that must not be it, and then, or you kind of pull away. And so that really answers some things for me, because if I tell somebody some of the experiences I might have, or some of my clients have, it seems like this huge, big thing, that you would never walk away from, and your whole life is now you're going to never have any problems, or you're never going to try again, I guess, because, or, do anything wrong because you've had this, this visit or whatever, but it wasn't, it just felt normal, and that's what I appreciated in your book, because I told you before, I says you have a vulnerability to your way that you teach, and the way that your book was, at least, that was very helpful, because I felt like you were working with me and walking with me along the path, instead of just telling me the stories of how that goes. But in your book, you talked about, you just some background as far as like, when tell us about that first experience with your guides, or the first memory you have, which is you were young. You were young.
A baby.
Yeah, baby.
The baby lying in my crib.
Wow.
And I could see like all these like luminous beings standing around me, like light-filled beings, blowing me kisses, talking to me, and it was like a party, and they were all glowing, and it was like rainbows and stars. It was so pretty. And then my mom walks in the room, opens the door, walks in the room, and they all disappear. That's my very, very, very first memory ever. But it just was one of those like psychic kids. I see dead people. I had I called them the gray people in my room. My house were haunted. And I think it was haunted because I lived there, and as a psychic children are often sort of ghost magnets, So it's not like, 8 million people died in my house. It's just like all the neighborhood spirits came around, and they would sit around my bed, and I called them the gray people when I was little. They were sad. They were lonely. I just felt sorry for them, and I would listen to them. I was never scared. I've really hardly ever been scared of spirits. People, on the other hand, terrify me on a regular basis.
Got it.
Spirits never have.
Yeah.
So I would just feel like, oh, I knew if I listened to them and they told me their story, they would feel better, and then they would go away, So my whole childhood was just like, and I remember like not being able to tell the difference kind of between what I was seeing. So I'd walk into a room and I would see I'm a visual psychic, so it's one of my strong, and I'd see things, and I'd kind of watch to see, like, does other people see that? There was my mom. I don't think this story made it into my book, but it's a good one. And my mom's best friend, we would go over there a lot. She had a daughter my age, and we would play. But there was this dead girl on the stairs, and she was like a kind of a creepy spirit. And I didn't like going over to that house because I'd have to walk by her on the stairs, and she would look over your shoulder while you were playing, and she was cold and sort of creepy. And the first time I saw her, I was like, I remember saying to my mom, I thought there was only one daughter. And my mom's like, well, I just got used to people kind of staring at me strange, because I'd be like, is that you see person? That thing. And so that took a little bit of orienting. That was a little challenging. And I really spent a lot of time trying to fit in and pretend to be normal, and try to figure out what's going on with me. So I had this sort of revelatory moment when my parents told me I couldn't go to the movies, but I went with my friend. I think I was 12, and we went to see the movie Poltergeist. and there's this, yeah, of course, it was great. I was riveted. Everybody was really scary when that came out, but I was like,
this is my life.
There's this psychic, this professional psychic,
right?
And I remember being 12 years old and being like, oh my God, I'm going to do that.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
gonna do that. Yeah. And then she says this little thing about like what a ghost is, and how you help them, and how they get formed. And I was like, something, and it started sort of a lifelong love I have of horror movies and paranormal movies. I got a very bizarre paranormal education by watching. I mean, because this was like the 70s and 80s. There were no books in the library. There was no spiritual teachers. There was no podcasts like this.
Right.
No internet. Think about it.
Right.
You know? So I was like, dang, I was just like hunting for any little information I could get about what was, without trying to freak people out around me, you know? And I remember going to the library and being like, do you have any books about ghosts? And she was like, ghost stories. And I'm like, no, I mean actual ghosts. And she was like, you know? And I think like it was really kind of painful for me. And I feel like it inspired me to write the books that I wish I could have found in the library when I was searching, to be the teacher that I wanted, to find it that I really couldn't, you know, to help mentor and train people to go through the process in a more graceful and easier way than I did, because I did it all the hard way, you know. And if I can help somebody, you know, manage their gifts and open up and find the purpose of them, because I believe they're very purposeful, then that's really what motivates me. That's really what I think my life purpose is.
Yeah. And I want to talk more about that. But first, what are your top 3 favorite movies?
Oh, favorite ones. I'll tell you the ones that were really impactful. Yeah. When I was Poltergeist. Yeah. And this old movie called The Changeling.
Yes.
Was
I watched
really
that over
good.
and over again.
Oh my God, it's such a good one. Another one called Ghost Story.
Okay.
It's classic, sort of old, you know, old haunting story from the 80s, you know. And then anything sort of in paranormal, like Close Encounters. Oh my God, Star Wars was probably the most impactful.
Really?
Yeah. And this idea that there was the Force, you know, that we're made of energy, because I could always see that, you know, can always see this. And Yoda's like, we are luminous eggs, you know, we're not this body. And I was like, wow. And that really informed a lot of myself, because I wanted to be a Jedi Knight when I was a kid more than anything.
I love it. You were. Do you find with your students, do you think that it's easier? Do they kind of, you know, I can see how growing up and stuff, having that sight, you know, came with a lot of baggage, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But also, do you find that your students, you know, is there a way that it's easier with sight, or do they all wish, do we all want to have the sight, or should we not want that because, you know how that goes? Because,
oh my God, I do know how that goes.
Yes.
Such a good question. Yeah. And you know, what's sad or unfortunate about this is that psychic seeing has become sort of synonymous with psychic. So now, you know, people say, well, what did you see? You know, it happens to the people that I teach Reiki all the time, and their clients say, what did you see? And if you don't see anything, you think you're not psychic. But it's really only one out of like 9 different, you know, psychic senses. And so I really like changing the word to perceive to experience. And so what did you perceive opens you to, well, I didn't see anything. I'm not psychic, but I heard this and I knew this and I felt this and I felt that in my body, and I, you know, smelled and taste that, and, you know, all the things, right? So or experience, what did you experience? When we change that vocabulary, it opens us. I've just seen a lot of extremely psychic people totally reject what they were getting because they weren't seeing anything. So I think you know, I'd really like to undo that if I can.
Yeah. And I thought that was, you know, throughout the book, there's a lot of different meditations, you know, and there's even like I played over and over again the map through the realms and those kind of things, which was just fascinating. And to feel my own comfort zone, you know, I'll have to tell you what I experienced. Oh
my gosh, I'm dying to know.
You know, it was fascinating, but you know, I think you know, like I say, with that balance in your book of just some vulnerability, I thought it was you honored the idea that somebody with mental illness shouldn't work on this, you know, like you honored and respected the what Eastern medicine and Western medicine type philosophies, you know, as well as, you know, just teaching some basics that I just think, oh my gosh, I really think that people really need to like read the book so that, because there's just so much. I mean, honestly, like we've talked about before, every child under the age of, I I don't know, and then younger adults too, but like kids that come in to me, I always know they have some sort of ability that they're dealing with if they're struggling, especially if they're struggling. I mean, it just seems to work out that way. And, like you say, we used to have no amount of, gravity used to be something that kept us down. Now we actually can move gravity and work with gravity to fly around the world, so, but back in, how many years ago that would have been unheard of, and so we kind of look at those things like, we bent that law, right? We kind of bent that law, and maybe we can take that kind of that idea or that permission and move it into these other ideas, because they're showing up for people, and a lot of people get it's they don't know what to do with themselves. They go inner shamed, or they're shamed by someone else, and it's causing a lot of trauma, like you say, that trauma.
Yeah, it's quite difficult, I think, for people, and really working with fear. So it's one of the first things I talk about, or first things I teach when I teach psychic development classes. We have to talk about fear. I get messages constantly. I really want to do this, but I'm terrified.
Yes.
And that's legit. Like, a lot of our ideas we have about this come from watching movies, paranormal movies, horror movies. It doesn't work out very well for the poor psychic in the horror movie. I mean,
you're right.
Honestly, so we have to kind of unwind what we're afraid of. We're afraid of, that people will think we're crazy, or that we're going to go crazy, or that we're going to attract negativity to us. We're going to see more bad things, that it's going to feel out of control somehow, so I think the very, very first thing we need to do is examine what we're afraid of. There's sort of these restraining forces that are on us that prevent us from really stepping into that gift. We're afraid, sometimes people don't want to hear their psychic messages, and kind of shut them down too, because sometimes it's all about like, yeah, you forgot milk at home, and don't forget your umbrella today. Sometimes it's that, but sometimes it's really deep stuff, like that it's are you sure about that marriage you're in, like, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night, like, boom, sitting upright in bed, like one of those moments, and just hearing this voice ringing in my ear, like, you're going to get divorced now. And I was like, no way. My kids were like 1 and 3 and 5 years old. And I was like, that was not on my agenda. Like, and it happened about 2 years after that. And I was just this like, and I even though I know better, I was like, la, 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 I didn't just hear that, and yeah. So I think there's sort of that we go through too, where we can sort of shut down because we don't always want to hear what the information we're getting is.
Yeah. And I think that's another important part too, that people see in more of a black and white, and maybe we need to open up the perspective, or the spectrum, is that you always have your own wheel, you always have your own will, and that always plays into everything. And that, so there's not so much getting it wrong, because, if that works, because that's the thing is, I mean, it wasn't a mandate. You didn't take it as a mandate to get divorced.
No, I didn't. I just took it as a foreknowing, and then I did everything that I could not to.
Right, right.
I did couples therapy. I did, I worked it hard not to.
Right.
And of course, we always have choice. We always have free will. We always have sovereignty. And I feel like that's really, really important to hold on to. As we go through our spiritual journey, not to give our power over to a psychic, over to your divination tools, or your pendulum, or your cards, or your angels. It's like, I've heard a lot of like, the angels made me do it excuses for people who, gave up their sovereignty for, and also we need to be very mindful of other people's sovereignty. So I talk a lot about ethics in this book, and I care a lot about teaching my psychics, my students, ethical behavior. And what is our ethical responsibility around the information we perceive about other people? That was super important to me.
So important. In fact, it was, you were going through the fears. I'm like, I guess sometimes that would be my fear, is like, what if I leave somebody astray? Because I've seen people like change their lives dramatically over what a healer has told them that they should do. And it's just devastating to me, because I don't ever want to do that to anybody, or to get to anywhere where I would feel like that would ever be appropriate, to tell somebody what to do. So I think that's
And I think ethical psychics don't do that,
Yes.
we present options, or we open up the field of possibility. We do healing work. We help people see things maybe they might not have seen on their own. But of course, no psychic is 100% right. Even the best psychics are right only 80% of the time. And so I think when we receive a psychic reading from somebody else, we have to really run it through our own truth meters and make sure that it feels true to us. And I have also done a lot of cleanup work for clients who have been like jacked up by a bad psychic, and just really damaged. And sometimes those psychics are purposefully either charlatans or scammers. Sometimes they're well-meaning people who just don't have enough training and don't have the ethical training, and say, they're too directive, like, oh my God, your husband's having an affair, you should get divorced. Well,
Right.
no, like that's like never a conversation that's going to happen, if you're an ethical psychic.
Yeah, it's helpful to have coaching training, because it's easier, better to ask questions than it is to give answers, maybe in a
truth, and that's what happened for me. Like, I started working as a psychic when I was 19, and this was like back in the 80s. And I worked for a while. I graduated from college, and then I started working full time as a psychic. And I soon realized I did not have enough skill to actually do this. So I went back to school and became a therapist.
Oh, good. Oh, that's right.
And combined therapy with psychic development, because I feel like that training has given me kind of this, foundation of how we help people, what's ethical, and what, what good boundaries are, and how we kind of manage to be in a role where we're truly helping people, and not just, I don't know, doing all the crazy things badly trained psychics do sometimes.
Right. I forgot about that. That is so right. I forgot that was also one thing that was impressive, is that you kind of bridged those two worlds. And I thought that was really amazing and fantastic. So I think we've talked about so many things that are so helpful, but let's say someone's just, interested, or they're starting to see, first of all, let's talk about what are some of those really first signs that people can get when those things are opening, like just kind of go through some of those, and then just kind of follow through with like, what is a safe way? What are some things to be safe about that when we just start to go, and when those things just start showing up, or we have this inclination to think that maybe these abilities are opening within ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. The very, very first thing I tell people to do is go get a journal. In fact, I just published a journal called the Psychic Awakening Journal. It's sort of a companion book to this book, Awakening Your Psychic Abilities. And the journals really help, because I tell people to start recording their dreams, recording their hunches, their nudges, their intuitions, their psychic hits, the signs and omens you see in the world. If you use divination tools and you're pulling oracle cards, which I think is a great idea, or you're using tarot, or you're using a pendulum, all these divination tools that also help flex the muscle of being psychic. We want to start recording everything in the journal, because those experiences are very ephemeral, kind of like dreams. You could have like this massive psychic hit on a Monday where you're like, oh my God, I see the light, and then a couple of days later, it's kind of gone. Like, it's sort of like out of your, you know what I mean? It's like evaporated. And unless you recorded it in your journal. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you do that, you're going to be amazed at how psychic you already are right out of the gate. And I think collecting things in a journal like that, start doing what we need to do. We need to pay attention. We need to listen. We need to honor all these things. Like, I used to say, if I wrote a book about psychic development, it would be called Pay Attention. But, like, what's happening in your body, what's
right,
things, and collecting it all in that one place can be like a very foundational way to kind of get started in a safe way.
I love it. I love that. Yeah. I tease sometimes, because it's like, like, maybe, hey, so if I know I'm doing okay, maybe show me this thing, and then you see it and they're like, All right, maybe 2.
I know. No, I'm not sure. Still show me another sign. Send me another sign.
Right. And
Yeah.
I mean, although, I recognize that within myself, I really felt like you gave me, it was just kind of like you saw that in me. And I was like, okay, that helps me, just for you to acknowledge that happens was helpful, because you're, like you say, I mean, Poltergeist was your teacher. Poltergeist was your teacher. In fact, who taught you how to use all of the pendulum, the cards, or how did you learn that part of it?
I've always been sort of lucky with my training, even though it's been difficult. But, when I got to college, then it was the 1980s, and all of a sudden it was the dawn of the new age. Hallelujah. And there were books. I was working in a new age bookstore.
Oh.
And there were books, there were psychic teachers, and the bookstore I was working in was hosting the people who were coming in and teaching. So I trained with some of the really, early runners in this kind of, how to channel. I trained with a shaman when I was in my 20s and learned some shamanic techniques. And I just would study and take classes, and, I was full on everything. This is what I was doing with my life. So I would find a tool and sort of add it to my toolkit. And sometimes, I've always been sort of on the cutting edge. Like in the early 1990s, I started doing house clearings. When you work for a psychic, as you work as a psychic, eventually somebody says, there's a ghost in my house. Can you help me? And I did 10 years of like paranormal investigations in the 90s before anyone was doing it. I mean, people were doing it, but nobody was talking about it.
Right.
There were no TV shows. There were no books. There was no guidebook.
Right.
I made every mistake you can make along the way. And some of them were horrifyingly dangerous,
Yeah.
Really sick. I brought spirits home with me. It was horrible.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, it was everything you can do. So I just kind of, I started really writing and teaching about psychic self-defense. So people wouldn't have to make the mistakes I make. And we can come into, most of the time, psychic work is very safe. But there are certain things we can do that are quite dangerous. Paranormal investigation is one of them. So I'm not saying don't do it, just say do it, heads up. People I think are drawn into that because it's sort of titillating. We really want to believe it's real, but we don't really believe it's real. And then, then all of a sudden you're in the abandoned mental hospital with a Ouija board, on Halloween. And that's a bit to me like, not quite believing in sharks, but chumming the water and then jumping in just to see if sharks are real.
Right.
Right. And they are. So you find out the hard way if you do that. So I teach a lot of psychic self-defense and talk a lot about that. And what do we do? There's sort of this catch-22. Would never open someone up psychically without teaching them psychic self-defense, because as we get more sensitive and perceptive, we need more filters. We need better boundaries. We need to understand how to protect ourselves. Most of the time, it's just the energy of other people. Sometimes it's the environments that we occupy. It's Murphy's Law, they're going to put the psychic in the haunted Airbnb or hotel room every single time. It's like, okay, yep, I got the haunted one. There's 800 rooms in this hotel, but I got the one where there was a triple homicide last week. But,
Great.
Yeah. And sometimes we need help with the spiritual energies in the world that spirits don't have our best interests at heart, So I think that and to me, because I was like, I wanted to be a Jedi, and I told you that, right? So I studied martial arts, and I was a martial artist, and I was kind of like really wanted to travel and wanted to be street smart and wanted to move around the world and not be afraid. So I like this idea of psychic self-defense. The more we know, the more street smart we are, the more we can explore these realms without worry, without running into the dangerous things. And if you don't know, you can wander into something dangerous without knowing what you're doing.
So on that a little bit, like, do you think that, there's people that are mean, alive people, you know what I mean? Like there's people that are just like mean people, and is it just kind of like the same kind of dynamic, except for on the other side, I mean, are there just, because I think, like you said before, I think people, I feel like they feel like there's like maybe one good angel and like a lot of like they automatically put it as negative, where is that true, or what would you say to that, or thoughts on that?
I've heard a lot of different theories on that. One of my old psychic teachers said that he felt like the world was divided into thirds, like third humans, a third spirit guides, and a third entities, non-helpful human spirit, non-helpful entities, beings, spiritual beings. I feel like sometimes that sort of rings true for me. I don't know if it's really the truth. I do think if you were kind of a jerky person, you might be a jerky ghost.
Right.
That definitely does happen. Like, but there is a lot. This is a very dense planet. Like, there's a lot of negativity. We got sort of 50% light and 50% dark down here, and so we have to deal with that, the dark things sometimes. And I don't have to tell you that. You just watch the news, and you know, like, you know what I mean? And there's sort of the spiritual equivalent of that darkness. And it hangs around in places where bad things happened.
I love the word dense, because that's almost the feeling of it. Like it's just dense. It's
dense and dark, and we don't always do good things to each other as humans.
Right.
And in like battlefields or places that are notoriously haunted, places like prisons, mental hospitals, because a lot of bad energy, is hanging out. If that's even denser. So the density is even denser in particular areas. That's where you get sort of hauntings or poltergeist or, negative astral beings, whatever you want to call them. They're around. Chances are good they're not living in your living room. But if they are, there are things you can do. That's when you call in the pros to get help.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, here at the Wholeness Network, we talk about this idea of wholeness, and I think you use the word at least once in your book, because it always perks me up when I hear it. But we always like to ask, like, just tell us a little bit about what you consider wholeness, or the idea of wholeness in your world, or in your way of thinking.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I so love that you have a whole network about that. That's just beautiful. I feel like we are already whole and moving even more and more into wholeness. That's kind of the take that I have on this. I would say as a psychic, we look at the whole picture of who we are as humans, and the whole picture of what's going on. And the more finely tuned your psychic abilities are, the more you see the wholeness of the picture, which provides a lot of really beneficial, helpful information for people that need, they're going through something, or they need help on the spiritual path. So that's sort of my spiritual journey, is trying to fill in, like, figure out what's really going on. What is the whole picture? Who are we as whole beings? That I don't know. I think we need to see the light and the dark at the same time. That's what we have, a shadow side. We need to look at that, but we also need to own our light. We need to look at that too. We're both. And to me, that's the whole picture.
Feel empowered every day with wholeness videos, meditations, downloads, classes, and more by joining the Wholeness Library at thewholenessnetwork.com.